I will invite Monsignor Robert Coleman, Associate Vice Provost and Minister to the priest community, to say the opening invocation and a few words about this lecture series honoring our grace, Archbishop Myers.
Thank you, Dr. Mazaku. It is good to be here for the now third annual Archbishop John Myers lecture. Archbishop Myers was so gracious to begin this lecture series in honor of the establishment of the Department of Catholic Studies. And so it creates such a wonderful relationship between the Archbishop of Newark and the university, particularly the Department of Catholic Studies. And so thanks must go out to you, Archbishop, for your kindness and your generosity, and for all the hard work which you have done and so many things accomplished working here with the university officials. We're so fortunate also to have our president, Dr. Esteban, and Mrs. Esteban. When the lecture series began, we were fortunate to recall the fact that our Holy Father, Pope Francis, had offered his great blessing upon this new endeavor of the Department of Catholic Studies. And so it was Mr. John Allen who gave the inaugural lecture. And last year, for the second lecture, Dr. Regis Martin. And so we're quite fortunate that for this third in the series of lectures, we have Dr. Robert Royal. But of course, what do we want to do? It's a tremendous need that all of us have, not only here at Seton Hall, but for everyone in their lives, is always the need to look to the Lord and to call on Him for blessings, for everything that we need. And so let us remember that when we gather in the Lord's name, He is in our midst, and so we pray. Almighty Father, you are the God of truth and light, and of love and righteousness. Make Seton Hall University a place which you have blessed, so that whatever is true and pure, lovely and good may dwell and flourish here. Let this university become a home of fellowship and community, learning and culture, that from her shall come forth a stream of servant leaders to share their blessings with their brothers and sisters, and to guide humanity into the way of peace. Help us gathered here in the work that you have given us to do. Enable us all to labor diligently in singleness of heart, remembering that without you we can do nothing, and that in fear of you is the beginning of wisdom. Help us, who are administrators and professors and staff, both by word and example, to lead the students to reverence truth, to desire goodness, and to delight in beauty, that following after these things, both those who learn and those who teach may come to know and worship you, the giver of all that is good, through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Monsignor Coleman, for your warm invocation and heartfelt introduction. Your Grace, Archbishop Myers, Monsignor Andreano, Vicar General and Chancellor, President Esteban, Mrs. Esteban, Monsignor Coleman, Dr. Royal, students, faculty, and distinguished guests. It is my honor to welcome all of you to the third Archbishop John J. Myers annual lecture series on law, society, and faith, honoring His Grace, Archbishop Myers. I am Inez Murzaku. I am the founding chair of the Department of Catholic Studies. The Department of Catholic Studies was established in 2012, the year of faith, and the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council. The program in Catholic Studies at Seton Hall University is a dialogue between Catholicism and culture that occurs in a very special way in a Catholic university. We are delighted and thrilled to sponsor the annual Archbishop John J. Myers lecture series on law, society, and faith. I am as delighted today to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Royal, a dear friend and collaborator. Dr. Royal, that I'm sure many of you know, is the founding president of the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C., and the editor-in-chief of the magazine The Catholic Thing. His articles have appeared in many scholarly and popular publications, including First Things, Communio, The Catholic Historical Review, Image, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and the list can go on, and his most recent book, which I highly recommend for everybody that wants to get a grip of the Catholic intellectual tradition, is A Deeper Vision, the Catholic Intellectual Tradition in the 20th Century, published by Ignatius Press. Before I invite Dr. Royal, I would like to give special thanks to the Office of the President, to the Office of the Provost, who support our events and the Catholic mission, the Catholic identity of this university. Department and Center for Catholic Studies, friends and supporters support our growing program and also the scholarships for students. Special thanks to two very special women who make everything run smoothly for the Department of Catholic Studies. The talented Miss Gloria Reno and also Miss Kathleen Childers. Thank you. I also want to thank our friends at the Relevant Radio, 1430 AM, the first 24/7 Catholic radio network in New York metro area. And I'm told that His Grace is going to be on the radio 4/14, so Thursday, 10:35, to speak about the joy of love. So please turn on the radio. And now it is my great pleasure to invite Dr. Robert Royal to Seton Hall University as the third Archbishop John J. Myers annual lecturer.
Well, I've given a lot of lectures in my day, but I think this is the first time that the introducer asked people to look for the fire exits, as if I was about to say something inflammatory, perhaps. And maybe I will, we'll see. I want to thank everyone responsible for this event, above all Archbishop Myers, who I've admired for a long time, and I think has been one of the leading lights of the bishops of the United States of America, and long may he reign. You're very lucky to have an ordinary like him in this archdiocese. I want to thank Professor Rosacco as well for thinking of me for this honor, and Gloria and Kathleen as well. I also commend you for this Department of Catholic Studies, because it's unfortunate that we need departments like this to help focus the Catholicity in our Catholic institutions, but we do, for various historical reasons and cultural reasons. And so that the work that this department is doing, I find to be crucial, not only for here, not only for the church, but for the world, because Catholicism is a religion that God sent to us because he wishes to redeem the world, and it's only when it's known in that world that we're carrying out his mission for us. Now, I want you to understand that I realize, if you look at the title of this talk, that it must have gone to my head when Professor Rosacco invited me, because not only am I going to speak about faith and about reason, but there are whole libraries about each of these things. But apparently I also wanted to speak about the great tradition of faith and reason in the Catholic Church. And if that wasn't already enough, I also want to add why it is that that tradition is still important, and especially important for us at this moment in history. Now, if there's any excuse for someone like me trying to take on this massive subject, the grand tradition of faith and reason, and why it's still important in our time, it's because there are so many interacting crises in the modern world that I think, even if I just laid this out in very broad strokes for you, there may be some value in thinking about it that way. I mean, in your courses, in your scholarly work, whatever any of you may be doing here, you will focus in on more specific things, but I want to sort of give you a broad brush picture of, first of all, the history of the interaction of faith and reason, not too detailed, but just so we understand really what we're dealing with. And then I want to turn in the second half of this paper to some contemporary ways in which we see how faith and reason are crucial to understanding some of the things that are most challenging for us. So, let me start. I've lived in Washington for 30 years, and I find quite often, I appear on radio and TV all the time, I find quite often that people think that Catholics are some type of fundamentalists. Because they think, primarily because we share with fundamentalists, with evangelicals and with others, certain basic truths from our biblical tradition, truths of faith and of morals, and that therefore, allegedly, we don't reason things out. We only accept them in a kind of blind faith. Now, some of our slightly better informed contemporaries sometimes have, somewhere along the way in their education, learned that that's not really the whole story, and in fact, Catholicism has a highly developed intellectual tradition. But many of them would think, that's medieval, or it's just not modern. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing is, to say the least, not self-evident. There's an interesting debate to be had, and it's being had about ancients and moderns. And this is one of the reasons why, actually, I wrote my recent book, which only came out a few months ago, called A Deeper Vision. Because in the 20th century, we've kind of lost our own connection to our own tradition in Catholicism. But in the 20th century, at least for the first 2/3 of the 20th century, the Catholic intellectual tradition of faith and reason, which I want you to take seriously, is the longest and richest intellectual tradition in the world. There is nothing at all like it. It's a tradition that goes back and gathers the wisdom of the ancient Middle East, classical Greece and Rome, the various peoples and cultures of Europe, and now, in its expansion around the globe, it is in an interaction with all peoples and cultures on every continent. And in the 20th century, it produced some absolutely remarkable work in the face of so-called modern challenges. And if you look back at the 20th century, for all the progress that was made in medical science, and technologies, etc., there were enormously destructive totalitarianisms, there were anti-human currents like eugenics, and I would argue also there was a massive narrowing of human life in a variety of ways that derive from modern rationalism and modern materialism. And I'll come back to this a bit later. Now, nonetheless, this great tradition has survived the rise and fall of many nations and even entire cultures, entire civilizations, and it will survive ours as well. As I say, there's nothing like it, and indeed, I would say that one of the reasons why many people have difficulties absorbing the fact of the Catholic intellectual tradition is that it's so big. It's so big, it's almost hard to see, almost too large to be seen in a way. Now, what I've just said, if you weren't Catholic or you weren't at Seton Hall University, you might think, well, that's exactly the opposite of what we've been taught about the history of Western civilization, right? For the last few centuries, it's often been assumed that faith is parochial, that Christians are a kind of a sect, right? They're kind of a small, irrational sect, closed in on itself. And that reason, right? Reason is the bold adventurer exploring the globe and the entire universe. Today, I think we have to say, and several recent popes have argued this, that for all those advances in science and technology, it's scientific and technological reason that we can see as sort of limiting the discussion, as narrowing what counts as real. And it's not only Catholics who see this. We notice that there are all sorts of crises in the environment, in our social life, in our cultural life, and our moral life. There are wide parts of our current culture who notice that. Now, of course, there is a proper scientific and practical use of reason, and I understand that the Department of Catholic Studies has got some programs on Catholicism and science. But this is not quite the same thing as being in contact with nature, right? Nature is not simply the descriptions that we find in physics or chemistry and biology. Or, even more crucially, how many of us can argue rationally now about why human beings are something quite different from the rest of the world? And why human beings need to be treated differently than the rest of the world? What kind of science do we have for that? It's especially telling. I notice this in Washington quite a bit, that we talk about equality and respect and tolerance for other people, but other than sort of practical or utilitarian calculations, we don't know why we believe in them anymore. We just do out of some sort of unexplained habit. I often think, when I talk about this part of our current culture, I think of an image that the American Catholic novelist Walker Percy has. It's like Wile E. Coyote, he's just chasing the roadrunner and he goes off the cliff and his legs are still moving for a while. Then suddenly he realizes there's nothing underneath him, and that's when he plunges down into the canyon and hits ground. We're like that. We talk about these things, but as I'm going to try to explain, I think we've lost that underpinning, and that's one of the reasons why our tradition is so helpful. Now, there are all sorts of scientific, in the narrow sense, efforts to explain what we need to do as human beings, where our morals come from, why we need to behave in certain ways. And I have to say, overall, I'm just going to say this outright, it's a sad failure. There's a very interesting Eastern Catholic figure, Vladimir Soloviev. I don't know if any of you have encountered him, but he's sort of a mystic and a bridge between Eastern and Western Christianity. And he once put this moral dilemma very cogently, I think. He said, the modern moral problem is that we say to ourselves, we are all descended from apes, therefore let us love one another. I think the same problem appears in neuroscience. Now, neuroscience can bring us great benefits, knowledge about the brain, but when you start to read neuroscientists, they talk about our belief in human knowledge and in human freedom as folk beliefs. Folk beliefs, as if these were tales that we tell ourselves that aren't exactly true. They can't really, I think there's no way that either evolutionary biology or something like neuroscience can account for the properly human things. We need a fuller sense of reason. And I think that only will come when reason is in conversation with faith. This is the important argument that John Paul II made in Fides et Ratio, his famous encyclical toward the end of the 20th century. And it's one of the reasons, frankly, why I founded Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C. I like to say that in Washington, faith and reason are both growth industries, so I'll never be out of a job. There's not too much of either. I can tell you there's not too much of either there. Now, we do have culturally a fuller and more coherent and more credible account of why it is that we think of human beings as something different than the rest of nature, and why we have to treat one another in a different way than we would the rest of the physical universe. And for our culture as a whole, it comes out of those very first pages of the Bible, where it said that God made man and woman in his image and likeness. There's a far distant echo of that in our Declaration of Independence, in the very first sentences. I'm sure several of you know it by heart. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, our founding fathers, who were part of the Enlightenment, rational men, could speak about rights coming from our Creator that they thought were self-evident. If you look around the world today, it's not self-evident to everybody that those rights exist. That in fact, it's probably only because the founders already still stood within that large tradition that comes out of the Bible, that tells us that in the very fundamental constitution of things, God made human beings in a special way. So of course the Creator made us in his own image and likeness, so that we have not only rights and can pursue goods in this world, but we ultimately will share in the divine life. That's a remarkable thing, and that is what once informed our public life, and I think is missing today, and it's one of the reasons why we have a great deal of difficulty in talking about moral and social questions. Now, I want to look back, because sometimes people look back at the history of what happened, the interplay of faith and reason throughout history, and get the wrong impression of at least how the Catholic part of the Christian tradition regards what happens. I mean, again, I may put this in a way that's unfamiliar to you, but don't feel that you can't challenge me or even contradict me when we're all done. I'll look forward to your questions or comments. It's difficult on a Catholic university campus not to think of the famous saying of the 3rd century Catholic thinker Tertullian when you talk about faith and reason. Some of you will recall that Latin phrase of Tertullian's, quid Athene Hierusalem limis? What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Now it's interesting that in the 3rd century, a serious Christian thinker would ask this question, because obviously he's asking the question because people are going over to Athens and borrowing some ideas, and in fact Tertullian himself borrowed some Aristotelian categories when he was trying to explain the Trinity. Tertullian was in North Africa, and interestingly, the North Africa, which was sort of the Midwest in the ancient Roman Empire, was this Archbishop Myers will appreciate this, who told me he's just a Midwestern boy. It was a down-to-earth, rock-solid, not fancy-frilled kind of Catholicism. And yet it produced some of the most interesting thinkers from the early times of the Church. Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, these are a little bit before and a little bit after Tertullian, and of course the great Augustine. And it's simply the fact that people are going to think. We're thinking beings. Reason has been given us by God as one of our powers. It's one of the ways that we've been made. So people are going to simply think about religious questions, even if they believe that God has spoken to us via revelation about things that we couldn't have reached by human intelligence alone. One of my favorite comments from St. Augustine is this: no one believes anything unless one first thought it believable. Everything that is believed after being preceded by thought. Not everyone who thinks believes, since many think in order not to believe, but everyone who believes thinks. Thinks in believing and believes in thinking. That's typical Augustine, right? Very intricate. So I think that one of the things we need to introduce into this understanding about the actual historical development of faith and reason in our Catholic tradition is those two cities, Athens and Jerusalem, which very early on were already interacting, and a third city. Because after all, Tertullian and Augustine both were writing in Latin. And that third city, of course, is Rome, where these things came together. Now, for the last couple centuries or so, scholars generally tended to believe, almost universally, but let's just say generally, that the Greek tradition of reason was something that was grafted onto the very simple message of the gospel. Now, today I think we know that it's a more complex question than it was once thought, but what came into Christianity from Hellenism was turned into something new. It wasn't just that Christians went over to the Hellenistic ways of thought, they actually rebuilt those ideas. And this process began even before Christianity. This is one of the surprising things I would like to put before you. We can't go into all the details here, but I want to look at a few pre-Christian texts. And in fact, I'm going to look at some pre-Christian pagan texts, just very briefly, as well as some pre-Christian Jewish texts. The first text I want to mention to you is a passage from Plato's Phaedo. Phaedo is the dialogue where Socrates has been condemned by the city of Athens, right? And he's going to have to drink the poison hemlock. He's waiting in the prison in Athens for a religious festival to end, and then he'll drink the hemlock. And he makes all these arguments about the immortality of the soul. And yet his followers are all kind of grieving. Because after all, those are only ideas, Socrates. You're going to die right now. And one of the followers around him, a certain Simmias, who isn't entirely happy, but he says this, that about the immortality of the soul, a philosopher must, and I'm quoting here, take whatever human teaching is best and hardest to disprove, and embarking on it as a raft, sail upon it through life in the midst of dangers, unless he can sail upon some stronger vessel, some divine reason, and make his voyage more safely and securely. Now, I call this divine reason, but actually the old Loeb translation is some divine revelation. Because even the ancient Greeks, some of them at any rate, knew that it was possible that God could speak to us, that reason itself could recognize that there was something beyond human reach. And if there was, and if these gods were personal gods, they might speak to us. And so faith was possible. And that became, as I'm sure many of you know, that became a very powerful way that Platonism and Neoplatonism began to interact with Christianity. Even more interestingly, I want to recommend a book to you, if you haven't already read it, by Joseph Pieper. It's called, I got it here somewhere, Enthusiasm and Divine Madness. And Pieper writes about 4 ways that in the Phaedrus, a different dialogue of Plato's, 4 ways that Plato talked about how the transcendent can come to us. One is through illness and catharsis. One is through erotic love, where we have taken out of ourselves. One is through divine prophetic utterance, and one is through poetry. So, beauty, suffering, love, prophecy, revelation. Pieper, in a text that I think is one of the most remarkable Catholic texts of the 20th century, Pieper says about this that here we are in the very midst, the high point of the Greek philosophical flowering. And Plato looks back to something that comes down from the ancients and that he encourages Phaedrus to pay attention to, because it is much more important than any of the practical reasonings that he comes in contact with. Now, we could go on with this, but we don't have time. We could spend a whole lecture series on that alone. Let me turn to the Jewish tradition, because we're often told that the Jewish tradition didn't care about thought, and it was all about the law and about the scriptures. But yet there seemed to be so much of an interaction between the Greek and the Jewish tradition that some people, later on in Christian times, used to talk about Plato as if he must have somehow, when he was in Egypt, read the Old Testament. There seemed to just be a convergence there. Now, the Old Testament was not translated until the mid-4th century BC, so Plato could not have read it in Greek. It was translated, the Septuagint translation, it takes place over a number of years, but it basically begins in the 4th century. And there's a very interesting passage. And this is the place where, even prior to Christianity, the two traditions, revelation and faith, reason and philosophy, are already beginning to converge. The Jewish translators in Egypt of the Septuagint come to the passage in Exodus 3:13, which is where Moses is going to go back and tell the Jewish people that God wants them to leave Egypt and go to the Promised Land. And he says, as you all know, who shall I tell them sent me? What is your name? Very often it's translated in English, I am. Tell them I am. Has called them out of Egypt. Now, there are scholarly debates about what that is, but in the Greek translation of this passage, you can look it up online, it's quite easy. It's even stronger than I am. These Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria in the 4th century BC translate this as ego eimi hoon. I am being. I am absolute being. So that philosophical reach out to what human beings can know shows up in a Jewish translation into Greek of a key moment in the Old Testament, in Exodus. Now, that kind of confluence resonated throughout the ancient world. It resonated through the early Christian writers that I talked about. It resonated even through the Arab philosophers in what were the Dark Ages in the West. It clearly resonated through the great scholastic writers like Anselm, and the best case of all, St. Thomas, Moses Maimonides, the Jewish writer in Spain. That had a long history. It wasn't just Greek thought or rational thought being tacked onto Christianity after the fact. People, as Augustine said, think about everything. And if they are believers, they think about believing. And that's our history in the West. Now, the philosophical side of this, the absolute being, people like Pascal tended to dismiss the God of the philosophers. Right? That's only a kind of an abstract deity. What Pascal would recommend to us, and what, of course, all of us need to embrace, is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of Jesus Christ, that personal God, not just an absolute being. But the thing I want to call your attention to is how long that persisted, over 1,000 years, and then even into the Renaissance. We often hear that the Renaissance was a period in which paganism sort of comes to the fore. Well, that's not quite true, and most scholars of the Renaissance now know that, yeah, pagan mythology was recovered because ancient Greek was being read again. There were models, people were trying to model themselves on the ancient Greeks and Romans and Latin and Greek because they were a much higher intellectual level than the people in the Renaissance. But they mostly did this within Christian categories, not as pagans. But the great flowering of the Renaissance is still within that current. It's within that field of human beings being made in the image and likeness of God with godlike reason, and therefore having a special destiny. Now, we in the modern world tend to think of faith and reason as somehow in conflict. And I think that there's a philosopher in the 18th century, Georg Lessing, who says that there's a great ugly ditch between faith and reason. It wasn't always so. And even just the brief notes that I've given you, you can see how one inspired the other. And then the other inspired the other back. And in that dialogue of faith and reason, which John Paul II said, is never concluded. That dialogue goes on, and both are wings on which we ascend toward the truth. The reason why we have the impression that faith and reason are opposed to one another is primarily because of the new science that gets going in the 17th and 18th century. Not because of science itself, but because the older vision of the universe, if you've ever read Dante, you've seen this, right? The Christian and Jewish, and even the philosophical stuff that comes out of Greece, it's all wound around this Ptolemaic view, this geocentric view where the Earth is the center of the universe, and the planets and the heavens are like a scale going up to God. Well, there's no geocentrism in the Bible. That was actually Greek science, and when it collapsed, it produced great fears. The great English poet John Donne says about that collapse, "'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone." And yet he remained an Anglican priest himself. But we have to recognize that people were shaken by this, and we, coming years after that shift in the view of the created world, we are even more distant from that earlier tradition. And so there's a lot to be done to go back and recover that. Recover it now in a program where you study science and faith, where you study even everyday activities like business. God is still among us no matter what the order of the world we see around us. Now, let me leap over a couple of centuries here, because I want to now turn to the second half of this presentation. I've gone over, I know, a lot, way too much. But I hope you'll see that faith and reason belong together. They give us something, real reason, what John Paul II called a reason of true metaphysical reach in Fides et Ratio. Real reason that doesn't just limit itself to practicalities and things in this world, is an enormously helpful tool in a faith like ours. So let me just talk about our current circumstances. I've lived in Washington for 30 years, so you have to indulge me when I read how that tradition that we all value and its loss, how its loss begins to impact us today. Okay? Now, this grand tradition of faith and reason is important ultimately important because it leads us to salvation, or not. But I want to look at two crises in our civilization, okay? One that's sort of internal to us, and one that's sort of external. And the internal one is the crisis of values, the ones that I talked about earlier that everyone knows. We have difficulty explaining why it is we believe what we believe. We don't have a great deal of confidence in our own civilization. Our civilization is very far from the best in both faith and reason. And let me take what may seem a trivial example, but I think it is not unrelated to everything I've said up until now. When Obamacare was being passed, and the president came forward to talk about how religious bodies would be dealt with, specifically on those questions of biomedical ethics, things like abortion, contraception, and whatnot, that were neuralgic points in terms of morality. He said in the presentation, well, yes, we have First Amendment rights, but women's health is fundamental. Now, the health of everyone in our society ought to be taken very seriously, but in our law, and one of the subjects of this lecture series is law, in our law, our First Amendment rights, those rights to freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion, are all protected precisely because of that tradition of faith and reason. It's when you're connected to the idea that human beings are, in a sense, divine, or on the way toward the divine, that you take seriously what people say and what they write and what they do when they get together and what they believe. And I think that the president, I don't mean to pile on with him, but just to take this as a test example, I think the president was able to say that, and it was convincing to some people, because it really does seem like, to some people, that those other things are really abstractions. They're not the real important business. The important business is those material values, like health, like economic development. And without the sacred canopy, the sacred space that is over all of us, we'll inevitably turn toward these more, sort of pragmatic, practical things and think that they're the most important thing in the world when they're not. It's not just the Little Sisters of the Poor. Right? I mean, why is it necessary? Why does it even seem plausible that you can ask a group like the Little Sisters of the Poor to do something that, as the Supreme Court relatively recently has said, can be accommodated by the government? It's actually because a different set of values not connected to our faith and reason tradition try to present themselves as actually more fundamental and that they can dictate to the older values, which are from our faith and reason tradition. It's a question of elites within the United States and also increasingly on an international level. Now, this one example gives us a kind of entry into why it is that faith and reason are more than just abstract intellectual questions. There's a beautiful reflection on faith and reason by a Jewish political philosopher and keen observer of modern society, Leo Strauss. He's a quite brilliant thinker. And though Jewish, he recognized the importance of faith, the Western faith tradition, to where we are. He said in a reflection on Jerusalem and Athens some years ago, Western man became what he was and what he is through the coming together of biblical faith and Greek thought. In order to understand ourselves and to illuminate our trackless way into the future, we must understand Jerusalem and Athens. Now, that was 50 years ago. We all know today that faith without reason can lead to all kinds of aberrations, right? Typically intolerance, xenophobia, fanaticism, idolatry, and religious-based violence, as we've seen in the Islamic Jihad. In reaction to a lot of this narrowing, what I call this materialist and kind of practical narrowing of human life, there are fundamentalisms of all kinds around the world right now. There's Hindu fundamentalism, there's Islamic fundamentalism, there's even Christian fundamentalism, and it's understandable. But the way to respond to this is not to just wipe it out, it's to bring it back into a relationship with reason, a broader relationship with reason. Now, we've all heard this argument that religion can be dangerous, it can be fanatical. But we don't pay quite as much attention, and we have a recent history that we can look to explain to ourselves what happens when reason operates without faith. In the 20th century, we had some experiments with this. Communism, which was a kind of attempt to bring heaven upon earth without reference to the divine, right, killed 100 million people outside of wars. This is, in the gulags, in repression, 100 million people in the 20th century, our great 20th century of advances. We also had Nazism that killed 40 million people. We had fascisms of various kinds. And we know from our Catholic intellectual tradition that since men and women are made in the image and likeness of God, as John Paul II said in his famous encyclical Centesimus Annus, 100th year, 1991, if you look back at the 20th century, at all those terrible pogroms and terrible slaughters and massacres and repression, it all stems basically from one error, and that is a wrong idea of the human person. Communism, thinking that human beings are only collective. Fascism, thinking that they need to be bound together in the fasces in a group. Maybe us in the West, the hyper-individualism. The Catholic understanding of the human person is somewhere between that. The human person made in the image and likeness of God is both connected to other people and individually responsible. An entirely different way of looking at things. That was the practical, public expression of the problem. But I want to go behind that a little bit. I start my new book, A Deeper Vision, with an anecdote. Some of you probably know the name of Jacques Maritain, probably the greatest Catholic philosopher of the 20th century. Jacques Maritain developed this sort of Thomistic understanding of the human person. He was the theorist of Christian democracy, which was not only important in and of itself, but it helped stop the advance of communism in Europe after World War II. He was one of the key figures in developing the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this philosopher had an enormous public influence in the 20th century. He taught at Princeton, he taught at Columbia, he taught at Chicago, Notre Dame, honored in a way that it would be difficult to find a Catholic intellectual to be honored in our day. But in 1901, when Jacques Maritain and his future wife, Raïssa Oumansov, were dating, they were students of science at the Sorbonne in Paris. And they were walking through the Jardin des Plantes. If you've ever been in Paris, it's one of the big parks right in downtown Paris, one day, and they recognized that the vision of human life that was presented by them in their classrooms at the Sorbonne was so bleak and so depressing that if they didn't find something else to live for, they would commit suicide together. Now, one thing led to another. They met Jean Péguy, Léon Blois, and the rest is history. Jacques Maritain became one of the great philosophers. But this was repeated over and over in the 20th century by people who recognized what it meant not to have that larger vision of human beings and of human life. In fact, it kind of became a joke by the mid to late 20th century. I don't know if any of you have ever read Muriel Sparks' funny novel, The Girls of Slender Means. But there's a character in there, a guy who's he's wealthy, but he doesn't know what to do with his life. And so he comes to think that at a certain point, he will either kill himself or take the equally drastic step of turning to Father Martin Darcy. In other words, it's Catholicism or nothing. Father Martin Darcy, by the way, was a real-life priest who converted any number of people in England in the 20th century. Now, Pope Benedict XVI gave a famous lecture in Regensburg in 2007, I think it was. He taught at the University of Regensburg in Germany before he became a bishop and then moved up and became pope. And he talked there about the three stages of what he called de-Hellenization. In other words, the ways in which we have left behind that interplay of faith and reason that we inherited from the Greco-Roman world. I won't go through the whole thing with you because we don't have time. But I'll just to point out the steps. He says, with the Reformation and with sola scriptura, we didn't think or at least people who accepted that principle, didn't think as vigorously about religiosity any longer. Then in the 19th century, when a sort of pragmatic approach to the Gospels tried to go behind the Gospels in scripture studies, he says we kind of lost the presence of what was there in those Greek texts that we call our Gospels. And then finally, in modern times, there's been a reduction of reason to scientific reason and pragmatic reason, practical reason and not very vigorous reason. And so we find ourselves with certain absurdities. I myself, in Washington a few years ago, was in a debate with E.O. Wilson. I don't know if you know E.O. Wilson is a biologist at Harvard, but he's a very influential scientist. And he wrote a book called Consilience, in which he tried to bring everything together, consilience being a kind of a total knowledge from science and from other disciplines. And I was at a debate with him at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. And at the dinner that evening, we continued the debate publicly, and we were in a room that was called the Jefferson Room. And I said to him, Dr. Wilson, I've got to say, I don't hear a lot of freedom in what you're talking about. That the vision of human beings that you have is one almost reduced to biology, even the mind. And he said, oh, no, he says, don't get me wrong. Only 40% of our behavior is determined by our genes. The other 60% is determined by a complex algorithm of genes and environment. And I said to him, complex algorithm? I don't think Thomas Jefferson would have thought that was a good defense of our liberties, to rely on a complex algorithm. And we see this sort of thing happen constantly. It's one of the sort of hidden difficulties, because we value so much what true science and true technology can bring us, that unless we have very good training, probably unless you've studied at a place like the Catholic Studies Department at Seton Hall University, you won't know where to turn and how to respond to that. Now, I want to conclude with just two cases. One is sort of an internal crisis, which is related to the scientific narrowing. And another one is an external crisis, which I think we can see most clearly, but it's not entirely limited to the current relationship that the West has with Islam. So let me start first with this internal difficulty that we have. One of the prominent features of modern Western societies, and it's not just the United States, we're actually not quite as far down the road as some other places. But one of the difficulties is our lack of confidence in our own culture. All right? Perhaps even to the point that we don't know whether we have a culture. That we seem to think that our culture is simply openness, tolerance, receptivity. These are all good things, and there's nothing wrong with this, right? But do those values actually exist on some foundation? Or do we just, as I said earlier, profess them because we've always professed them? Why should we be tolerant? Why should we be respectful of other people? So when we find ourselves having to defend our own culture our culture is not perfect, our country is not perfect, Western Europe is not perfect. We feel a certain guilt because we don't really know why it is we believe what we believe. And I think that this plays out in a variety of ways in our culture and in other cultures that have been influenced by the West. That's our internal problem. In France, and places like Belgium, as we've been seeing recently because of terrorist attacks and difficulties in dealing with radical Islamism as it's sometimes called. The crisis is much, much deeper. It's not simply a matter, as we're often told, of people who've been marginalized, in other words, haven't been accepted. It's not simply that people haven't been shown respect or welcomed into countries. It's a difference in certain understandings of what human beings are. I'm not saying, by the way, that Islam does not have within itself similar currents that are somewhat parallel to our own in the West, but not all of them. And if internally we don't have a confidence and an ability to act on the basis of why it is that we think that certain things are important, we're not going to do very well in responding to a radical challenge. Now, let me just bring forward another very interesting book. There's a Catholic political philosopher in France called Pierre Manon, who has written a book called Beyond Radical Secularism. It hasn't been published in English yet. It will be published, I think, in a month or two. And Manon is trying to figure out, in France, how is it that in France, we French can have a kind of a social contract with our Muslims, because we don't want to exclude them. We don't want to simply say that your religion or your values are of no importance, but what is it that in the West, our tradition of faith and reason boils down to such that certain things are not negotiable? Let me read you some of the things that he suggests. Minimum requirements, he thinks, so that Muslims could live at peace in France. I read this not so much for what it is in itself, but for what it tells us about the tradition of faith and reason. The first thing he says is that the state should be, the French state, should be allowed to prohibit the burqa. That's the veil that only leaves a little slit for women's eyes to be seen. And he says it's permissible for the French state to do this because in the West, we believe in the dignity of all human beings. And if I cannot see your face, and you cannot see my face, we are not human beings interacting in the same way. We are not persons present to one another. We are not manifesting ourselves. We're not affirming full personhood. Any society that affirms liberty, equality, fraternity cannot accept that any people within it are closed off from others. And the second thing that he says is that the family has been so important that polygamy cannot be tolerated within a place like France. Now, as I understand it, these things are not, neither of those two things are essential to Islam. Right? That these are sort of cultural practices, they aren't necessarily religious practices. I don't think, by the way, that it's necessarily going to be the case that in France you can come up with a covenant like that. I think it's going to be very difficult. But Manon says we are going to try to affirm these things because we in France still have what he calls notes of Christianity. Christian notes, like the respect toward persons, like the valuing of marriage. One of the early critics of Manon's proposal said in France, he doesn't seem to get that there's no such thing as Sharia light. That it's the whole thing or nothing at all. But these are accommodations. These are accommodations that might make it possible. Then, of course, there has to be a renunciation of terrorism and loyalty to other states and caliphates and whatnot. All very unlikely, but all interesting in that they connect back up what is really non-negotiable in our culture. That it's actually in a conversation with a different civilization that we seem to see things that otherwise might be invisible to us. And so in that way, it might be actually a benefit to us. But let me conclude with this. Maybe the most important thing for us in the West is that we, through these interactions, through the crises that we're facing in our own country here in the United States right now, and we're going to see, by the way, much more pressure on religious institutions in coming years. My friend Cardinal George, I'm sure you've heard this story, used to say that he would die in his bed, his successor would die in prison, and his successor would die a martyr. And then his successor would be a saint, evangelizing America with a new evangelization. I don't know if that's exactly true. Cardinal George has passed on, and we'll see where things go from here. But certainly our idea of the dignity of every human person from conception till natural death is going to be placed under tremendous pressure, to the point that I tell my wife that I just hope I'm going to be able to be allowed to die in a Catholic hospice somewhere and not get the modern equivalent of a hemlock, from our government. On the question of marriage, we've already found ourselves in a position that we are regarded as the Ku Klux Klan. That to affirm that view of marriage as between a man and a woman, which is basically the view of all civilizations everywhere, is looked upon as the rankest prejudice. When you see places where even speaking against gay marriage from the pulpit is regarded as something that the state can pursue, and this has happened in Texas, we're facing the clash of two entirely different ways of understanding human life, public life as well as private. Our understanding is from that ancient tradition of faith and reason, which can be brought into the modern world. But this is not relativism. This is a substantial position that is seeking to respond to what exists in virtually everywhere. And we, as Catholics, are not defending something that a bunch of Italians over in Rome with too much time on their hands invented as the Catholic understanding of marriage. We're defending Moses. We're defending something that goes back to Moses. So, even as we in our modern multicultural society try to be welcoming, try to be open to other societies, try to be open to other individuals, the key for our way forward, as Leo Strauss says, is to understand that interplay of Jerusalem and Athens that came together in our Catholic tradition and flowered there more wonderfully than anywhere else. And it's precisely on the basis of that confluence and that flowering that we affirm the value of every human being, and we affirm the freedoms that we have in the United States. And that's one thing that our tradition of faith and reason has that is unique and can offer enormous help for our troubled and confused world. Thank you.
Dr. Royal, it was really very enriching and illuminating, and really the faith and reason is the foundation of a Catholic university, because it's this very rich and packed, I can say, Catholic intellectual tradition that we are unpacking one thing at a time, in other words. And also we are real custodians of this Catholic intellectual tradition, and we need to transmit it to our students and to the next generations of Catholics. This is really the purpose of a Catholic university. Now, please, we'll take some questions for Dr. Royal. Don't tell us that you are clear if you have to be like, yes, please, please, yes, yes.
Nowadays, I think that we are English. We require much more faith than believers. Not to live about it in this time is irrational thinking. And even the people who are doing this situation are no reason. For example, the word of creation of the world. The universe. Each level of faith is a scientific fact. And the best proof of that is that people who initiated compulsion with Einstein were not aware of it and were against it, but at the end had committed because of reason. And it was not a reason from a father elementary who mathematically sitting in the desk, not seeing or thinking. The evil of good man discovered and not fact. And the universe we began to know when and how. This is amazing. I mean, there's a question of how. Now, most mainly believe and we thought about belief. Now it's scientific fact. Or rational now is very strong factor to believing in it. And today it really was and gradual faith in your faith. Faith that they were confident in their question.
Okay, that was a comment.
Yes, please.
Yes, I have a question for your opinion, which is looking at discussion now on faith and reason, which is certainly a key point in education and debate we have now between those people of faith and whatever. My own experience, I guess, and that's your experience, which is you can only get so far. Reason requires it, and very often conversations stop when the effort to reason gets to a point where someone has to let things on. In your experience, when they discuss something, other people go share your views. Is it your experience that they only go so far that there is a point that does hold something within the reason that people are unwilling to go further? I find that I'm very active in my science program very often. We get to a point where it requires the candidate to whoever to think. And it's encouraging question and answer. Very often it's very difficult to encourage people to reason to sit with. Is that yours?
I'm going to make a Thomistic answer to this. You know, St. Thomas says that the number of people who can do philosophy and theology is very small. Either they don't have the capability. Seminarians, you're not allowed to use this as an excuse, by the way, or any of you, by the way. But he says, you know, that most people don't have the capabilities or the time or the inclination, and so you're always going to be dealing with the fact that deep reflection is going to be the province of very few. But there's a difference. I've taught philosophy for theology a couple of times, and I tell the students, because they're very worried about, if I reason, am I going to lose my faith? And I tell them, no, when you're finished with this course, you're never going to be intimidated by anybody telling you that it's not rational. Again, you know, you're going to have some arguments. You may not remember the arguments, but you'll know there are arguments. And see, the difficulty of creating this sort of culture of faith and reason is that there needs to be those Christian notes that Pierre Manon was talking about. There are certain things that we recognize, and you know, let's give America some credit. We still do believe in respect for human beings up to a point. If you're in the womb or you're kind of burdensome, too old, and maybe you're handicapped, we're getting weaker and weaker about that. But I think that those are the places where you can appeal to reason and reason to explain to people why it is, you know, you believe that you're made in the image and likeness of God. You don't have to understand, you know, I am, But you can't understand that it's wrong to mistreat people a certain way. I have a friend who was Jewish and became Catholic because he was very pro-life. He was a Kantian philosopher. But he just understood that that thing in the womb had a human DNA and it was alive and you can't kill it. And he said to me once, you know, it hit me that a faith that believes that God himself could be in that little host, that's why it can also see that that life in the womb is a human life. So, you know, there are all different kinds of reason. There are different ways of reasoning. And maybe, you know, intellect or intuition is part of human understanding as well. It needs to be parsed out so that it isn't just bias. But you're right, I mean, you're going to have troubles. But that's why you're teaching. You can be clever and try to find your way around these cultural obstacles that are in front of us. There was somebody else. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Your one reference that you made specifically was across George prison and Waterloo. You know, I sometimes look at trends and there's some kind of overwhelmed by numbers. I mean, you know, there's such a massive global shift that's with economics and sort of like the lowering standards of global culture. It seems like it's going to become more and more difficult to confront that, and that reason and faith will be just more and more marginalized. And just sort of kind of side of this trend. I mean, how do you see the outposts of hope and faith, say, in combating what I, as I say, sometimes I see as a title?
You know, Benedict XVI used to say quite often, actually, that only God can straighten out the world. We can't do it. We can try to do everything that we perceive needs doing and do it with whatever energies we have. But I think the reason why he said that, I mean, he's a very hopeful, gentle man, is that the situation you describe is quite true. Around the globe, things look pretty desperate. There's a new global culture that's emerging that is not based on the fullest truths of a human person, and that therefore cuts corners, like, you know, killing the young and the old and the handicapped. Treats sexuality as if it is just like shaking hands, and, you know, marriages can be formed and dissolved rather casually. There's no real depth to that type of human person. A lot of the reaction to that situation, people know they need more. You know, that is what I think needs to be looked to on both the faith and the reason side. It starts out, I think Pope Francis is, in spite of all the controversies we're in with Pope Francis, I think one of the interesting things about Pope Francis is the way he engages people. And it's when you start to engage people that you never know what's going to happen. But by and large, you know, the general cultural trends are terrible. I mean, all these movies that you see that are apocalyptic, it hit me a few years ago that the reason we keep seeing that is because a lot of us feel like that's where it's going to go. It's going to be some sort of major crash. You know? So when things get to that level, there's no predicting. I mean, I'm sure that the Romans, up until pretty close to the end of the Roman Empire, thought that it would last forever. Well, see, I think what you're saying has certain affinities with why I tried to talk about the Greeks. Because, there was this myth that kind of grew up in the Enlightenment, that the Greeks were the real origin of Western civilization, right? We jump over all of Christianity, as if Christianity even exists. Then you actually go back and you look at the Greek mystics and Greek thinkers. I'm talking about the pagans now. And they have intuitions of this. Aristotle says, when he's talking about absolute being, he says, we look at this and we contemplate it, and we shouldn't say to ourselves that it's not worth doing this because it's beyond us. Because every little inch we can get there is infinitely more important than so many other things. And for most people, it's not a matter of thought. They have a child, and they know that that child is not, to put it crudely, a bag of chemicals that happens to be functioning in one way now and will stop functioning further down the line. Or they see something beautiful and get a sense that there's more to life. The Greeks are quite sensitive to that. So there's a kind of common human experience, and we believe, I think one of the things we as Catholics have got to take more seriously, Joseph Ratzinger started his life working on subjects like this, is that history is important. We tend to think about abstract theology and philosophy, and rightly so in its sphere. But it's the way that God works through time that is unique in our biblical tradition. There's no other tradition that thinks that, the time usually is in cycles. In the biblical tradition, we have a sacred history, begins with the Jewish people, passes into the history of the church. Time matters. The time that each of us spends in our lives matters. The way we interact with other people matters. C.S. Lewis says in one of his most beautiful passages that other than the Eucharist, your neighbor is the most holy thing that is present to your senses. How many of us have an intuition or a sense of that on a daily basis? But you're right. There are things. Look, I want to also say this. It is utterly essential that programs like this, departments like this, be working vigorously in a lot of institutions, because once the cover comes down on intellectual life and people assume there's nothing else out there, oh yeah, I had a beautiful thought the other day and I looked at my children, and if they are not able to connect that with something bigger, and you can only learn that in interaction with other people, or seeing other people as part of some tradition that you yourself want to participate in. That has to be the living way that it comes to people. There may be some occasional converts who read Aquinas or Augustine or something, but it's usually a different way. Well, modernism is a big, it's a big category. Look, the great advantage that we have as Americans was what I read from the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, the great American Jesuit, John Courtney Murray, who was influential in Vatican II, getting the Vatican to accept religious liberty, once said about that passage in the Declaration, he's got a very interesting book called We Hold These Truths. He said, this phrase tells us several things. First of all, there are truths. Second, we can know them, right? Because there could be truths out there, and so what? It's like the truths of particle physics that very few of us in this room probably know. And then he said, and third, we Americans hold those truths. So for us, it matters that God existed and created human beings in a certain way. Now that I think has to be the deepest meaning of our American founding. And insofar as that continues, we're within, very broadly and somewhat indirectly, we're within that large Christian tradition of faith and reason. Modernism, I think, takes off in a different direction, and it's more akin to the sort of secularism that you have in France, which is a much more radical secularism. There's a properly secular dimension to societies, because you don't want the church dictating, what policy toward China ought to be or something. There's a secular realm that ought to have its own proper activity. But secularism is an ideology. When you believe that secularism, that the secular explains everything, well, then you're into modernism, materialism, skepticism, relativism, all the things that really have caused a crisis of values and of life in the West.
Okay, then. Thank you so much, Dr. Royal, again, for this wonderful lecture. And thank you for coming.